You've heard of these seven wonders of the ancient world, right? Of course you have. But what if I told you one of them might be a ghost? A legend so powerful, we all just assumed it had to be real. I'm talking about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. For centuries, people have been searching for it, and they've found absolutely nothing. So tonight, we're not just looking at history, we're investigating a full-blown historical cold case.
The story we all know. It's straight out of a fairy tale. You've got King Nebuchadnezzar II, and his wife, Queen Amytis, is terribly homesick for the green, lush mountains of her homeland. So, what does he do? The only logical thing, of course. He builds her a mountain. A man-made paradise, literally blooming in the middle of the desert. It's a beautiful, romantic story. And it might be completely made up.
And here's where that beautiful story starts to fall apart. For more than a century, archaeologists have been digging in the ruins of Babylon. A massive German expedition spent nearly 20 years there at the turn of the 20th century, meticulously sifting through the dirt. They found palaces, the massive city walls, the incredible Ishtar Gate, but the gardens? Zilch. Not a single stone, not one brick that could be linked to it. Which leads us to the huge question looming over all of this. How does an entire wonder of the world just vanish without a trace? Are we just chasing a ghost, a beautiful mirage that ancient writers dreamed up? Or, and this is where things get really interesting, have we all been digging in the wrong place this entire time?
All right, let's start with the case against the gardens even existing in Babylon. Because when you look at the evidence, or really the lack of it, you can see why historians have been so skeptical for so long.
So, the most damning piece of evidence is just silence. The Babylonians recorded everything on clay tablets. And King Nebuchadnezzar, that guy loved to brag. He left detailed records of every temple he restored and every wall he built. And yet there is not one single mention of what would have been his most incredible creation. The only accounts we have were written hundreds of years later by Greek and Roman writers who had never actually seen it. The case for Babylon is incredibly thin.
But you can't just toss the whole story out, because while the people who were actually there were silent, those later writers gave us some unbelievably detailed descriptions. Yeah, they were secondhand, but they all seem to be working from the same playbook, painting a picture of something truly astonishing.
So take this one guy, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE. He described something that looked like a giant terraced theater, rising tier after tier. He says it was about 65 feet high, and get this, it had soil so deep on each level that you could grow the largest trees. We are not talking about a few potted plants on a balcony. This was a literal forest built on top of a man-made structure.
But here's the really mind-blowing part, the technology. How do you keep tons and tons of water from turning a mud brick building into, well, mud? Diodorus actually lays out the blueprint. He describes this incredible, multi-layered waterproofing system. First, stone beams for a base, then a layer of reeds set in bitumen, which is basically asphalt, then 2 layers of baked brick sealed with cement, and the final, crucial layer, a covering of lead sheets to make sure not a single drop got through. This was genius-level engineering. And looking at this cross-section, you can see just how smart it was. Each layer had a specific job, creating this massive, sealed tray in the sky that could hold an entire ecosystem. Without this exact technology, the constant irrigation needed to keep the trees alive would have caused the whole thing to collapse into a pile of sludge.
Okay, so we're stuck, right? We have a legend with no proof in Babylon, but these super specific engineering details that sound really plausible. For a long time, that's where the story ended. Until one scholar came along and decided to ask a radical question. What if we're all looking in the wrong city?
And this is where Dr. Stephanie Dalley, an Assyriologist at Oxford, comes into the picture. She spent 2 decades, think about that, 20 years, poring over ancient cuneiform texts, chasing down clues that everyone else had missed. And what she found proposed a theory that turns the entire legend on its head. This table just lays it all out perfectly. The legend points to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, but the evidence, according to Dalley, points to a totally different king, Sennacherib, in a completely different city, Nineveh, about 300 miles to the north. Where Nebuchadnezzar's records say nothing, Sennacherib's boast about building a wonder for all peoples. Where Babylon's water source is a huge question mark, Nineveh had a massive, well-documented system of aqueducts. And the kicker? Where there are no traces in Babylon, reliefs from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh actually show a garden just like the one described.
So, let's meet our new prime suspect, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king. And unlike Nebuchadnezzar, this guy wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master engineer, and he was totally obsessed with water.
And these are his own words, straight from his inscriptions. He talks about creating a palace that was a wonder for all peoples. Sound familiar? That phrase is a direct parallel to the language used for the other 7 wonders. He even bragged about creating a new way to cast bronze to make giant screws for raising water, basically inventing the Archimedes screw centuries before Archimedes was even born.
And this isn't just stuff he wrote down. We have the hard physical evidence. Archaeologists have literally found the remains of his gigantic aqueducts. This very inscription was discovered on the Jirwan Aqueduct, part of a water system so enormous that early pilots flying over it thought it was an old highway. This was a king who could move mountains, and he could definitely move rivers.
The sheer scale of what he did is just staggering. He built a whole network of canals, dams, and aqueducts that stretched for 50 miles to bring water from the mountains straight to his capital city, Nineveh. All of a sudden, the biggest engineering problem of the gardens, how to water them, has a very real, very impressive solution.
So here it is, the final piece of the puzzle. How did everybody get it wrong for so long? Turns out, it was a simple case of mistaken identity. After the Assyrians conquered Babylon, they started referring to their own capital city, Nineveh, as the New Babylon. Over the centuries, the distinction got lost in translation, and the amazing wonder built in Nineveh got mistakenly attached to the more famous, older city. Mystery solved.
So, with the mystery of the location finally cracked, we can do something people have only dreamed about for thousands of years. We can actually see the Hanging Gardens as they probably were.
Let's step out of the history books and into our imagination for a minute. Using all the clues we've uncovered, the Assyrian texts, the palace reliefs, the archaeological evidence of Sennacherib's incredible engineering, we can reconstruct this lost wonder, not in Babylon, but in its true home, Nineveh. And there it is, a tiered mountain of life, rising right up beside the king's palace. It would have completely dominated the skyline, a monument not just to a king's power to conquer people, but his power to conquer nature itself, making an impossible forest bloom in the desert.
And as you get closer, you see the beating heart of it all. That water, carried for miles by that colossal aqueduct, pouring onto the highest level. From there, it's channeled down through streams and waterfalls, a constant lifeblood for the entire structure. Can you imagine the sound? In the middle of a hot, dusty Mesopotamian city, this place would have been filled with the sound of cool, running water.
Now, just imagine walking along one of those pillared walkways. The air is cool and it smells like damp earth and fragrant flowers. And we even know what you'd be seeing. Sennacherib's own records tell us he planted cedar, juniper, almond, and quince trees, grapevines, countless other exotic plants he brought back as trophies from across his empire. It wasn't just a garden, it was a living library of his conquests. It was paradise on earth.
So, the Hanging Gardens most likely did exist, just not as a romantic gift for a homesick queen in Babylon. It was a brutal monument to power and engineering genius, built by a ruthless conqueror in Nineveh. It was a true story that history simply misplaced.
And that leaves us with one last thought. The legend of Babylon was beautiful, and it captured the world's imagination for over 2,000 years. The historical reality is an incredible story of detective work and staggering engineering. So does solving the mystery take away from the wonder, or does knowing the true complex story of how this marvel came to be and how it was lost to history somehow make it even more incredible?